Welcome to this event organized by the Canadian International Council in Ottawa. The title of this panel discussion is Israel and Palestine, A Path to Peace. As you may know by now, my name is David Dement. I'm the president of the Canadian International Council's National Capital Branch. I want to welcome you, as each month, whether you're in this room or watching a recording of this evening's discussion. Cet événement est organisé par le Conseil international du Canada. Si vous êtes ici à l'hôtel Sheraton à Ottawa, ou vous nous suivez grâce à un enregistrement de notre discussion, je vous souhaite la bienvenue. George Jacoby will chair the panel and introduce his fellow panelists. Peter Larson, a member of our board and of our Middle East Study Group, will offer comments and thanks at the end of the discussion. It is my privilege to introduce you to George Jacoby. For almost half of George's career of 36 years at DFAT-D, he served in Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Iran, Libya, Ethiopia, and Algeria, and dealt with issues in the region ranging from the Iraq War to relations between Israel and Palestine, the subject of our discussion this evening. George is both the program chair of our dinner meetings and the chair of our Middle East Study Group. George, merci à vous. Et merci aux autres membres de notre panel ce soir. George, thank you, and thank you to the other members of this important panel, Israel and Palestine, A Path to Peace. I want to let you know the Twitter handle for tonight's event is hashtag, this is for the 30-somethings, terribly important, by the way, hashtag CIC-Ottawa _Israel Palestine. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, David. Wearing two hats tonight as sort of dinner program manager, speaker manager, and chair of the Middle East Study Group. I did want to take this opportunity to thank David and all the other members of the executive of the CIC National Capital Branch and past presidents who may be in the audience, past executive members. Let's say the executive part of the CIC for keeping us on track, for keeping our programs going, for allowing us the resources and the energy to organize these events, and to recruit a lot of us into the CIC family to keep up the discussion on international affairs and Canadian foreign policy here in the National Capital Region. Et je voudrais remercier aussi tous les participants dans l'audience, les fidèles de notre programme du Conseil international du Canada qui suit notre programme et qui nous appuie dans notre programmation sur les affaires internationales et la politique Canada à l'étranger. It's going to be a very topical and important and interesting discussion tonight on Israel-Palestine, a path to peace. And I guess it's a path to peace with sort of a question mark. And we have three distinguished speakers to give us their views on the current situation regarding Israel-Palestine and the prospects for an agreement. You might have seen in the notice that we put out a particular proposition, the CIC, as follows. We said that, gee, I can't find it now. Yes, I couldn't make, my computer broke down, so I couldn't make a copy. Well, our proposition was that the American government is directing significant resources to finding a path to peace in the Middle East. And as recent leaks from the ongoing negotiations suggest, the question we're asking our panelists is, can the numerous elements of a wide-ranging agreement be built upon the foundation of a quid pro quo where Israel accepts the 1967 borders and Palestinians agree that refugees who hold another country's passport cannot claim a right to return to their original homes in Israel. And then we also noted that through the determined positions taken by the Canadian government, we would ask our panelists to consider whether there is perhaps a role for our country in contributing to an agreement either now or in the future. And by putting out that proposition, we don't want to restrict our panelists. They can talk about anything they want concerning the current situation and elements that might enter or not enter into a framework agreement, everything from borders to security to the status of Jerusalem. Israel is a Jewish state. What kind of a state in Palestine? Anything they want to talk about, but we would ask them to sort of look forward to see if a negotiated agreement is possible, and if it's not possible, perhaps to think about some alternatives, and also to talk about a role for Canada. So just for our French-speaking audience, notre proposition, c'est que c'est le suivant. Si le gouvernement américain consacre d'importantes ressources à la recherche d'une solution vers la paix au Moyen-Orient, comme les fuites récentes durant les négociations semblent l'indiquer, la question est de savoir s'il est possible de construire les multiples éléments d'un accord d'une telle envergure sur la base d'une contrepartie où Israël accepterait les frontières de 1967 et les Palestiniens conviennent que les réfugiés qui détiennent un passeport d'un autre pays ne pourraient pas revendiquer le droit de retourner dans leur pays foyer d'origine en Israël. Et nous voudrons aussi que notre panéliste discute les positions déterminées prises par le gouvernement du Canada et peut-être le rôle de notre pays, le Canada, peut-il jouer un rôle pour contribuer à un accord. Mais ce n'est pas pour restruire le commentaire. Il peut parler comme il veut sur cette question. And each speaker will speak for about 15 minutes. And then we'll have about an hour, 3/4 of an hour for discussions. And then Peter Larson, a member of our executive, as David said, will thank the speakers. So our speakers, Michael Bell will go first, former Canadian ambassador to Israel, Jordan, and Egypt, an expert commentator and an academic, teaching at the University of Windsor, and writing extensively in Canadian newspapers from his almost unique perspective, working on this issue during virtually his whole diplomatic career. I first met Michael, actually, if I could be allowed one anecdote, when he was coming with Mr. Stanfield on his trip to the Middle East. And he may have actually drafted the first report on Canadian policy in the Middle East. And as a result of that, Mr. Stanfield came back and established a groupe de réflexion on Parliament Hill, which has been discussing the Middle East ever since. But after that, Michael worked both in Ottawa and in all his diplomatic postings, and in retirement has been working on issues like Jerusalem. So he's going to give us a unique perspective. And then Shimon Fogel, Executive Director for the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs, working to improve the quality of Jewish life in Canada and abroad, and to increase support for Israel and strengthen the Canada-Israel relationship. I believe Mr. Fogel was with the Prime Minister in Israel and Palestine recently. Maybe he can tell us something about the visit. He's also been named in the Hill Times as one of Canada's top 100 lobbyists, so very successful. And then our third speaker is Thomas Woodley, President of Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East, which is a nonpartisan organization, national organization based in Montreal, working to promote justice, development, and peace in the Middle East and in Canada. And Thomas may have something to tell us about, and as will Shimon, about some of their various activities. But I know they have a fundraiser coming up in 2 weeks in Ottawa.
In this very same room.
In this very same room,
In this very
okay.
same room.
And so they're working hard to towards a solution and a settlement as well. And Thomas has a varied background, and maybe he'll tell us more about that and why he got involved in this particular issue. So I think we can begin with Michael. And merci bien à tous nos conférenciers pour participer ce soir. Merci en avance. Michael?
Well, I'm flattered, and I'm sure our other speakers are, to see so many distinguished personages in this room and the size of the turnout. I hope it's, at the end, you feel it's been worth your while. What I want to talk about is perhaps somewhat different than you might expect. I want to get to the basis of the problems which confront the two parties and use that as a means of identifying what has to be done if there is to be a durable and sustainable peace settlement. So I'm looking at it in broad conceptual terms, and I see two nations, both in search of security and fulfillment. And two nations that have a strong societal identity, whereby individuals see themselves as part of a group that has certain goals, feelings, cultures, mythologies, and narratives, hence Israelis and Palestinians. And what this identity involves, it seems to me, are providing to both a sense of solidarity with each other as members of their group, and that their group serves a higher purpose. And to enable this, sustaining narratives are developed, which tell the story of the people, the particular society concerned, as victims, as political leaders, as societies that are sustainable in terms of their own integrity, of resistance. In other words, peoples in these societies, for the most part, share a common purpose. And to achieve that common purpose, they both feel a prerequisite, an imperative, if you like, is a homeland or a state. Land. In other words, there cannot be national self-fulfillment without an identifiable land on which this people live and call home. Another factor in this list, in my list, is societal identity doesn't create, but reflects a group of people. And in this case, and in many, many cases, it's reflected by outgroup aggression. It's the other guy's fault, not mine. As my wife can tell you, I've never made a mistake in 40 plus years of marriage. I think it, and I can't blame her, so it must be the dog. And there is a sense, more seriously, of collective angst that peoples share, communities share. And it's angst because of concern for the future viability of their nation, of their society. And I use the term nation here in the French meaning as a societal group rather than a legal paradigm of the state. So there are two nations here looking for a solution. Now, most often neglected and worrisome to me is the dynamic relationship which exists between politics, the stuff we read about, the stuff we think about every day, and the mind. In other words, how are mindsets determinants of the way people act? And it seems to me that in the history of both Israelis and Palestinians, more latterly Palestinians, that this mindset, this approach, and what have you, is a vital element which is ignored at one's peril. Now, as an example, I want to say that any attempt to replace these two group identities with an overarching identity, we've heard that a lot lately, a one-state solution, I view as highly threatening, because neither people can, I believe, or want to make the tremendous adjustments that would have to be made were they to try to merge into a common identity. It's just not going to happen. And if an attempt were made, the friction that would be created between whose society it was and who controlled it would be endless. In other words, there are no common goals that society as a whole could share to make this enterprise work. I want to talk a little now about the negotiating realities. When one sits down to negotiate, what does one look at? Well, as I mentioned, one of the first things people look at is the concept of the other. It's the other guy there, the other guy who's trying to do me in, who's trying to subvert me, who's trying to frustrate my legitimate goals. And we see the other as an object for which we can blame various things go wrong. Couldn't be us, must be them. This is very unhelpful. It's very, very hard to avoid. Another negotiating risk is exclusionary preoccupation. It's just my side that counts. I've got to get the best deal I can for my people. And that means if we can reduce the demands of the other, if we can minimize them, if we can force them into a situation where they have to give up things, we end up ahead of the game. I would argue that exclusive focus, of course it's a natural focus, it has to be there, but ignoring the needs of the other creates a situation where whatever might be achieved probably is going to be unsustainable into the future. And that requires the third point here that I want to bring up, and that's perspective. You've got to have perspective. You've got to be able to take a step back as well as a step forward. And you've got to try to see it and as though one weren't part of the system. Again, very hard to do. Perhaps what the Americans are trying to do in working now with Secretary Kerry. The fourth element, I think, is empathy. It's very difficult to develop empathy, but both peoples, I think Palestinians and Israelis, have a narrative. And the narrative does not mean it's wholly fictitious. It means it's simplified, made easier to understand so that it gets spread widely in any given society. But when you're sitting down and negotiating, I've always thought it's better to understand the guy you're negotiating with than to ignore him. What happens so often, and I think the Americans, particularly Dennis Ross, I remember very many people saying that Dennis Ross viewed everything as a transaction, that he could not get his mind around this global need to satisfy the needs of people in terms of what they felt was important to themselves as a group and individuals. You know, so you'd sit down and you'd draw a line, and the line wouldn't, one party would have a problem with this line, and he'd redraw the line a couple of kilometers further away, or he'd push it up, or he'd push it down. That's great, and it's inevitably part of any negotiation, but it too often ignores these basic psychological and human needs. And there's been plenty of it. Aggression against the one party against the other, emotional aggression, and obviously much more material types of aggression. So I would argue that sustainable agreements require accommodation. They require meeting the basic core needs of the other. Because if there's no accommodation and those basic needs are seen to be ignored or imposed, you know, you will accept this because you don't have any choice, so you better take it or leave it. The danger there is, on the one hand, it can be a good thing to force the parties to get their nose to the grindstone. On the other, it can mean that an agreement will be unsustainable. And the only thing worse than the present situation, if you like, is an unsustainable agreement that's bound to fail because of the inequities written into the system. And that's why I really don't like the term when we're talking about negotiations of he made a concession, or she made a concession, or they made a concession. I much prefer the term accommodation, because I think there are ways, and I'll talk about it in terms of our work at the University of Windsor on the Jerusalem Old City, to meet basic needs of both sides, so that both sides end up as winners. There's no zero-sum game, through mechanisms of accommodation, where neither has to give up their core needs or requirements. Now, just to repeat again and to be clear, coerced agreements create ongoing resentment, and these become self-fulfilling prophecies. You're convinced, you force the parties into a situation that they don't want to be in. This therefore creates resentment. This therefore works against the success of the agreement. Now, for the last 9 years, I've been working on a project called the Jerusalem Old City Initiative. And I've been doing this with colleagues here in Ottawa, particularly Mike Malloy, but colleagues from within Canada, the United States, Israel, and Palestine. And we took on this challenge because no one had ever looked at solutions to Jerusalem, or at least academics and public policy makers whose work was public, in depth. I know that at Camp David, because we had two of the Israeli negotiators at Camp David on our team, Gilad Sher and Pini Maidan, both strongly encouraged us to do what had never been done before. So we took the old city and we said, we'll develop a governance system, and we'll get guys like John de Chastelain or Roy Berlincat of the RCMP, and we'll have them look at security deep, deep down. How do they patrol? What kind of rights do they have? What kind of rights do Israelis and Palestinians have in this old city? How can this come together in a workable framework which still gives both Israelis and Palestinians a sense of ownership in East Jerusalem? And why so important? Because the old city is the icon of the physical and spiritual identity of both sides. So this goes beyond turfs. It goes to, if one is religious, it goes to the highest heights of religiosity. If one is less religious, it still is a symbol of a people or of a nation. So for Jews, the old city, I would say, is a core focus of identity. And for Muslims, it's the focus of their passion. So the Old City Initiative was needs-based. We started out and we said, what do Palestinians need, reasonably need? how they want certain rights within East Jerusalem that will guarantee that they can make this part of the Jerusalem conurbation their capital. How can that be done in a way that does not threaten Israeli interests? And we dug down, and I must say, if you're young enough, you may live to see 3 volumes, about 1,000+ pages of our work being published by Routledge. The contract has been signed and everything. And I don't want to disparage any of the fine academics in our class, but it's not like in foreign affairs, where they say, get me that memo, we need it tomorrow, or we need it this afternoon, or what have you. This process just goes on and on and on. And it's not necessarily useful as a hot tool. Now, all the parties that need to know the detail. But as well, we wanted to use it as an example and to be studied, to be reflected upon, and as an example of how digging down into a problem helps to reassure people. You'll know what kind of police you'll get. You know how they'll be paid. You know where they'll be living. You know what the court system will be like. You will have a voice in all of these things. There will, very, very briefly, we'll have an executive board, composed of Israel and Palestine. They would control the mandate. We would have a special regime for the Old City and a chief administrator. And believe me, if you don't have any time for a weekend or something, I could fill your ears 24/7, and we still wouldn't be there. You might be asleep, and that might be a good thing. So when we look at all this, and I look at all the time I've spent dealing with this, what we do have today, which we didn't always have in the past, is we really do know what the shape of any realistic, comprehensive solution is going to be. We can say we're far away on this or we're far away on that, but we know there is going to be, if this is successful, some kind of security mechanism in the Jordan Valley. The Israelis, as I understand it, want it to be an Israeli military presence. Others want a NATO presence. But we basically know security, Jordan Valley, Jordan River. So we know the borders, more or less. We know about land swaps. We know about demilitarization. We know that in the Jerusalem case, unless there's an accommodation for both Israelis and Palestinians, particularly in the Old City, nothing's going to work. So one can say, well, the Palestinians don't need this, or the Israelis don't need this, or this is Arab turf from time immemorial. Well, fine, but that's not going to solve the problem. It seems to me we all relish our preoccupation with the past, and we all relish criticism. But when it comes time to put hard ideas on the table that might work, well, that's not quite so appealing. But yet it's the essential element. But yet, as I say, we're stuck in the mindset and rhetoric of otherness, of looking at each party as the other. So I would argue that success requires greater understanding. Otherwise, we're stuck in this bloody status quo. And that status quo, or that bloodiness, would not disappear. So I would argue that there is a way of meeting basic core demands without sacrificing one's vital interests. And those accommodations are sine qua non for a durable peace. So I tried to draw this together in a very thematic way, and what I think is a political, psychological dimension, if you like, that determines why people act the way they do, and how those factors have to be the core of finding a resolution to the problems of the Israel-Palestine question. Thanks.
Well, you may be wondering what I'm doing up here, since I was introduced to be third and now I'm second. And I'm happy to say I've already learned something from what Michael said. I've learned how to accommodate my fellow co-panelist. My fellow co-panelist asked if I would go before him. I thought, why not accommodate and show that I've learned something. My name's Tom Woodley. I'm with Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East. George asked me to talk a little bit about my organization and myself before I begin. My organization, our mission is to empower Canadians of all backgrounds to promote justice, development, and peace in the Middle East. And that was our mission for several years, and then we realized that really put a sort of a foreign policy, too much of a foreign policy spin on things. So we added, and here at home in Canada, because quite often the things that happen in the Middle East influence perceptions of, say, Muslims, Arabs, Middle Easterners here in Canada, and vice versa. Things that happen here influence perceptions in the Middle East. So we added that. But our mission is actually to empower people. You can consider it yourselves. To hopefully we can empower people like yourselves to promote justice, development, peace in the Middle East. And I'm certainly encouraged, as I'm sure the organizers and the other panelists are, to see so much interest here in Ottawa tonight to discuss these issues. My own background, I have, if you can believe it, I'm an engineer by training, master's of electrical engineering, but I also went back to school and did a master's of public affairs, worked in the US federal government for several years, actually in the executive office of the president, which sounds very ostentatious, but actually there I was one of 1,000. So it's not all that impressive. I came up here about 20 years ago to marry my beautiful wife, and about 10 years ago, through various things, we started Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East, partly because we really didn't feel like there was a voice in Canada doing the types of things that we felt needed to be done. In fact, when we got started, we thought, let's join some organization that's promoting Palestinian human rights. And we had, well, at least in Montreal, we didn't find something that we felt was actually doing what needed to be done in terms of promoting those human rights. So we are about justice and human rights. Sometimes people, I think it's an attempt to smear us. Sometimes people, they call us pro-Palestinian. And I sort of find that funny. We're actually about pro-justice. I like to call us pro-justice in terms of supporting international law and supporting human rights. And that will somewhat be my focus here tonight. Let me just organize my papers. Don't worry, you're not going to get all 17 pages of this. It's boiled down to about 3 pages. I was rehearsing in the car over here. I drove up from Montreal earlier this afternoon. So, George that was certainly a broad canvas that he gave us when he introduced all of us, and I was happy to see that Michael had sort of whittled it down to certain things that he wanted to say, and I've sort of done the same thing in my own way. Let me just comment, well, let me just go ahead and start, and maybe at the end of my presentation I'll comment on 1 or 2 things that Michael said. I think to start off with, I'm very hopeful and thankful that there are negotiations going on between Israelis and Palestinians. I think we have to be thankful that John Kerry has spent much of the last 9 or 10 months shuttling back and forth to the Middle East to try to get this going. There hadn't been talks for about 3 years, at least prior to that. And I think Israelis and Palestinians pay a heavy price for every year that passes without a deal. And I think a continuation of the status quo would be morally and legally unthinkable, unacceptable for all. That being said, I think we also have to think about what we really envision for a Middle East, for Israel-Palestine. And I certainly respect some of the things that Michael said, but I think there's something that perhaps was missing in part of his discourse is just the gross imbalance between the two sides. And as I did some reading prior to my presentation here tonight, just the sense among the Palestinians that all that's being negotiated is stuff that already belongs to them. The negotiators aren't negotiating about whether or not Palestinian soldiers should leave Haifa. They're not negotiating about, whether or not Israelis in Tel Aviv should live under Palestinian military law or Palestinian civilian law. They're negotiating about things relating to the West Bank and Jerusalem. And that's how very much the Palestinians see it. If you compare the two peoples in terms of their gross domestic product, the actual gross domestic product for per capita for a Palestinian in the West Bank is about $2,000. In Israel, it's about $35,000 gross domestic product per capita. It's even worse in Gaza. If you're in Gaza, your gross domestic product per capita is less than $1,000. In Israel, it's $35,000. A gross difference. If you look, sometimes when there's talk in the media about a conflict or a war, the war in Gaza, it's not a war, it's a crapshoot. In fact, sometimes Israeli soldiers describe it as there's this organization breaking the silence, and testimonies from Israeli soldiers that have been involved in conflicts. And in Operation Cast Lead a few years ago, one of the Israeli soldiers afterwards said it was like burning up ants with a magnifying glass. It's not a war, it's a crapshoot. So these are things that we need to keep in mind, much as I respect the many points that Michael made in terms of the identities of the two people and so on. But let's just think about what we would really envision for Israel-Palestine. And hopefully you share a common vision with me. Common vision which would be to see two communities that are allowed to fully thrive. Two communities that can freely and proudly celebrate their cultural heritage. Two communities that are able to pursue their economic future unhindered by restrictions or conflict. Two communities that benefit from the creativity and industry of their people. At an individual level, personally, I want to see individuals in Israel-Palestine enjoying full rights as citizens. The right to live and move where they may choose. Equal access to commercial, academic, and cultural opportunities. A common legal system with equal legal protections for all. And for those Palestinian refugees that don't live in Israel-Palestine, that are in Jordan or Syria or Iraq or Lebanon, I also wish something for them. I wish for them to have the right to return to their homes if they choose, or to accept compensation instead. And more importantly, for those Palestinian refugees, who number now almost 5 million, an admission on the part of Israel that Israel created a great wrong in turning the refugees out of their homes decades ago. So this is what I would like our vision for these two peoples to be. A truly thriving communities, a pair of communities. And I think what I'm talking about is more of a vision for justice and less a question of just talks or how to divide the land. I sometimes think of the Israeli-Palestinian relationship as somewhat like that of an abusive marriage, where the husband has been physically abusing his wife, his spouse, for years, and we all know it. We, the friends of the couple, we want to help them. So we say, yes, indeed, they need help. We should get them to a marriage counselor. We should get them talking, working out their differences, absolutely. But the first thing we need to do, the first thing we need to say, is the abuse has got to stop. The abuse has got to stop. We'll get them to counseling, but before anything else, the battering of the wife must stop. And you may be wondering what I mean when I refer to injustice, this abuse. So let me just give you a few ideas, and obviously you can get very detailed, and I don't really want to drag you down to a lot of the muck of the details, but it is important that we mention some of these things, because what we're talking about is not theoretical. In fact, sometimes I'm troubled by the way people talk about these things in very theoretical terms and not real terms, in terms of their parents who are concerned that their children won't get safely to school, or that the fathers won't get safely to work, or that they won't be able to harvest their livelihoods and so on. These are very real things, but let me just go through a quick list of some of the abuse that I think many of us are aware of. There's the arbitrary confiscation of Palestinian territory, whether for military purposes, for the construction of Israel's wall, for the expansion of Israel's illegal settlements. There's controls on Palestinian movement and access, preventing Palestinians from accessing their lands, their agriculture, their jobs, their schools, their healthcare, or other travel for religious purposes or commercial purposes. There's the house demolitions that Israel performs. Over 27,000 Palestinian homes and structures have been destroyed since 1967. Over 94% of Palestinian building permit applications are rejected by Israel. And we're currently at a 5-year high, if you're interested. There's the arbitrary arrest and detention that Israel commits against the Palestinians. And currently there are over 5,000 Palestinians in Israeli prisons. And quite a number of them are children, several hundred of them are children. And many of the arrests are performed at night at gunpoint. There's a pass and permit systems controlled by Israel that control medical evacuations, travel for studies abroad, travel to visit family in other parts of the West Bank, prohibitions against travel between the West Bank and Gaza. So this is a highly asymmetrical conflict, like the abuse of marriage. And to address this conflict without addressing the asymmetry is a big mistake. One champion, someone I admire beaucoup, Archbishop Desmond Tutu of South Africa, said, "If you are neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor. If an elephant has its foot on the tail of a mouse, and you say that you are neutral, the mouse will not appreciate your neutrality." I think we can all agree with that. But it's highly asymmetrical. One Israeli human rights organization, the Israeli Coalition Against House Demolitions, talks about what Israel is doing as Israel's matrix of control. And indeed, it would seem that Israel actually holds all the cards. And I am hopeful and I am thankful that we have negotiations going. But you also have to recognize that that Israel holds all the cards. And I asked myself, well, if Israel holds all the cards, why do they want to consider any sort of arrangement? And in fact, key Israeli leaders actually think this way. Israeli Cabinet Minister Naftali Bennett openly opposes the negotiations. Just a few weeks ago, he was saying the western area of Israel, the West Bank in other words, is not just a territory, it is the land of Israel. Our descendants will not forgive an Israeli leader who would split our country and give away our capital. In December, just December 2013, 2 or 3 months ago, the Israeli cabinet voted 8-3 in favor of outright annexing the Jordan Valley. So here Michael Bell is talking to us about, well, they're talking about the negotiations for the Jordan Valley in front of John Kerry, but actually the Israeli cabinet votes in favor 8-3 to actually just annex the Jordan Valley. So we've got this asymmetrical conflict on our hands that would require that we need really an excellent mediator, wouldn't we? And a mediator that would seek to rebalance this imbalance or compensate for this imbalance, for this asymmetry. And so as we think about the negotiations that are getting going, and we look at this and we sort of say, what hope can we have? And I am hopeful. I do truly. It's imperative upon the international community to see a solution there. But we also have to raise serious questions. It's not a theoretical sort of thing. We have to raise serious questions about the process and the mechanisms. And when we look at the United States as a mediator, we need to raise certain questions about that. Being neutral, and it would be my dream if the United States were neutral as mediator in these negotiations. But of course, with what Desmond Tutu is saying, he echoes what a number of other philosophers and thinkers have said as well. Being neutral in this sort of situation just isn't appropriate. We hosted Robert Fisk, the famed English journalist who'd covered the news in the Middle East for about 30 years. He came to Canada last year, and I actually traveled with him for about two weeks. And he talked about balance in media coverage. And he said, at the beginning of my career, I used to cover the soccer match. Well, he called it football, but he used to cover the soccer matches in England. And he said, okay, there, it's fine. Okay, you want to give balance. This team, competes against that team. They have a match. You want to give balance to, the coach here or the star player there. That's fine. But he said, when I got to the Middle East, he said this concept of sort of giving equal time didn't work anymore. He said, what I found in my reporting is I was drawn to those stories where, the balance should align to the actual the suffering and the pain experienced by the people that I'm talking to. So it's not he doesn't feel at all that it was right to sort of I got to give 5 minutes to this person, I get 5 minutes to that person. No, where is the abuse? Where is the pain? Where is the hurt? And that was his approach. And as we look at the context of the negotiations going on right now, knowing that this is not the first time negotiations have been launched between these two peoples, and knowing this vast asymmetry, understanding this vast asymmetry between the two peoples, I think we can reasonably point out several concerns with the talks as they exist now. I have 5 concerns I'd like to bring up, and we can explore them more. And certainly there's tons that I would like to say, and hopefully we'll have time for them in the Q&A. But just 5 primary concerns. One is, first of all, does the approach of the talks at this point favor one side over the other? I think one of the things that disappointed me, of course, was that the talks were launched despite the fact that Mahmoud Abbas, representing the Palestinians, had asked the Israelis to stop expanding their settlements, their illegal Israeli settlements in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. And so Israel refused to do so, and eventually, through various discussions, I guess they got the negotiations going. But it's sad to see that, because the facts on the ground are changing even as they're negotiating. And if you haven't heard the analogy already, often people talk about this as sort of a situation where Israel is eating the pizza while they're discussing with the Palestinians how to divide the pizza. And that just doesn't feel right to me. And with the current focus of the negotiations, there seems to be this focus on division of territory and very little discussion of international law or human rights. And in the spirit of Mr. Bell's comments about, recognizing the other, and quick tangent here, I think it's important, obviously, that when we talk about human rights, we talk about the human rights of all of them. And for instance, CJPME, my organization, we are ready to criticize anyone who's violating the human rights or international law. So there are times when we've criticized Hamas. There are times when we've criticized Fatah. There are times when we've criticized Hezbollah. We criticize Israel because of their violations of human rights and international law. And then, unfortunately, we don't see that from the Canadian government, but that's another discussion. But to Michael's point, in terms of Yuri Avnery, a former member of the Israeli Knesset, I read an article by him not long ago, and he said apparently John Kerry has 160 people helping him to sort of work over the negotiations. And he said, well, rather than having 160 workers, professionals, he should probably just get one good psychologist. And because Yuri Avnery's approach, he just sort of felt like the two peoples were just sort of so far apart and misunderstanding one another. And one example that he gave was, when Palestinian prisoners are released from Israeli jails, and there's so much rejoicing in the Palestinian territories in the West Bank and Palestine, and yet there's so much resentment towards that among the Israelis. And look at this, they're rejoicing that these murderers have returned home, and yet the Israelis can't see that these are people that are seen as having sacrificed 20 years of their lives in an Israeli jail in a fight for resistance. And so Yuri Avnery was saying, look, you just need a psychologist to help these people to understand one another. There's certainly an element of that, but I think we do have to not forget this gross imbalance, as well as a need to focus on human rights. I mean, ultimately, we are humans, right? And do we not care about the well-being, the welfare of our fellow human beings? So we have this extreme focus on territory. How we'll divide things up? Will there be Israeli troops in the Jordan Valley or not? We lack this focus of human rights, and which undermines key Palestinian grievances. There's hardly any acknowledgement in the current negotiations of the 5 million Palestinian refugees who are in exile. There's no consideration of the rights of Palestinians in Israel. There's little talk of international law. There's little talk of ensuring certain rights for Palestinian civilians in terms of having the right to carry out their livelihoods, farmers being able to access their fields, students being able to get to their schools freely. My second concern with the negotiations as they're currently set up is I'm not sure that Kerry and the U.S. advocate equally for both sides. The Palestinians so far have said that the framework that they're working within with Kerry in the U.S., it's vague when it comes to issues important to Palestinians and detailed regarding Israeli concerns. Kerry has proposed, for instance, Beit Hanina as the capital of a future Palestinian state and not Arab East Jerusalem. Huge departure. The Clinton parameters always called for that. This is the first time that's ever been proposed. Kerry's plan includes no Palestinian refugees returning to Israel proper. Olmert offered to accept 5,000 of them, and Ehud Barak had a whole team of negotiators at Camp David discussing the issue. Kerry seems ready to endorse this insistence on the part of Israel that they maintain a long-term 10-year at least 10-year military presence in the Jordan Valley. So are Kerry and the U.S. actually advocating equally on both sides? And to my point with the Desmond Tutu quote, maybe the Americans should actually be more watchful over the rights and grievances of the Palestinians to make sure that to counterbalance this asymmetry. My third concern is, does the framework for a solution approach actually work? A lot of the rhetoric seems to be borrowed from the Oslo Accords, doesn't it, in terms of, an interim agreement serve as a framework for a permanent agreement and a final status agreement. That's great, but it didn't work for Oslo. It didn't work for Oslo. Did we study what happened? Why did Oslo fail? Have we studied that to understand how we're going to do something differently to this time so that actually if we get a deal in place that it will actually hold? And I think from the Palestinian perspective, Oslo has left a legacy of a lot of Israeli control where it didn't exist before. In terms of, for instance, a few examples, Israel controls Palestinian custom taxes, the collection of Palestinian custom taxes. Israel legitimately, or has some legitimacy under Oslo to sort of retain control over areas in B and C in the West Bank. Oslo also created a certain limbo in terms of human rights. Okay, well, Oslo's in place, but what about human rights? Well, Oslo says this, but human rights say that, and they're in conflict. So which of these remains? Which of these dominates? So if we go with a framework approach, we need to make sure that we have an enforcement mechanism, that we learn our lessons from the Oslo experience. My fourth concern or consideration here is, and I think it's shared by many Palestinians, is can Abbas deliver the goods for the Palestinians? For many Palestinians, there's very little optimism for what Abbas may be able to accomplish. He was elected in 2005 to a 4-year term, and here we are in 2014. He's still representing them. Now, officially, he negotiates as head of the PLO, but the Palestinian National Council was last elected in 1996. So, something to think about. Officially, Abbas negotiates on behalf of all Palestinians, but it's hard to say that he adequately really represents Palestinians in Gaza, Palestinians in Israel. We had Hanin Zabi, a Palestinian-Israeli member of the Knesset a few years ago, and that was one of her main beefs with the Palestinian leadership in Abbas and so on, was that there was no consideration of her and her people in Israel. The Palestine Papers of 2011 indicated that Abbas and his team had offered far more than most Palestinians were willing to cede. Palestinian Papers, if you haven't heard of them, they came out just about 3 or 4 days before the Arab Spring broke in 2011. It was a huge, huge story, but it was totally eclipsed by what was going on in Egypt at the time. But very important revelations in terms of how much the Palestinians had offered to the Israelis, and even then the Israelis weren't content with all that had been offered. Now, fortunately, Abbas has said that he's willing to subject any agreement that he comes to a popular referendum, and that's a good thing, and we'll hope he lives up to that if they come to an agreement. And even more, Hamas has said that they will accept a referendum, that any agreement that is accepted by a referendum of the Palestinian people. There's this final question, this concern, and I don't know, maybe you share my sort of puzzlement over this question of why is Israel so concerned about whether Palestinians recognize Israel as a Jewish state? Anyone share? Was anyone sort of confused by that? Oh, come on. I'm the only one? Okay, one person in the back. Good. We should talk after. In any case, no Palestinian leadership could accept this demand and survive. Israelis know that, and that's why the demand is being made. Why is this so unacceptable to the Palestinians? Well, first of all, Palestinian acceptance or Palestinian recognition of Israel as a Jewish state would constitute explicit Palestinian acquiescence to the permanent second-class status for Palestinian citizens of Israel. Second, it would totally liquidate the rights of the 5 million Palestinian refugees. And finally, it would give implicit Palestinian acceptance that the ethnic cleansing of Palestine was morally justified. So that doesn't seem right. But one analyst said, look, Israel is free to declare itself as a Jewish state. It's not up to the Palestinians to control that. I mean, you have the Islamic State of Afghanistan. You have the Islamic State of Pakistan. There's nothing preventing Israel from saying, well, we're going to be the Jewish state of Israel. And let's see what the international community says to that. It's not up to the Palestinians. But in any case, this is something that's on the table that just, I think, sets a bad taste. But you know what? I am hopeful, and hopefully you are too, because we have to be hopeful. We have to be hopeful. And I am concerned because, indeed, I have to be concerned as well. Martin Luther King Jr. said, "Peace is not the absence of conflict. Rather, it is the presence of justice." Thank you very much.
So my strategy was that if Mr. Woodley goes first and he takes up a little more time, I'd be on the hot seat for a little less time. And that's why I'm one of the more influential lobbyists in Ottawa, because I was right. The truth is that it's only fair. I only had to walk across the street from the World Exchange Plaza to get here today, and Mr. Woodley had to drive a couple of hours from Montreal, so I think there is some equity in giving him a little more time. But from my experience in joining and contributing to conversations with group, I found that the most useful thing for me, as well as for those who have given of their time to join, is to engage in that discussion and conversations. So I really would like to keep my words very brief so that we can hear from you and I can gain some insight as well. The truth is that that's far more comfortable for me, because as I look around and I see, as Professor Bell mentioned, some distinguished ambassadors, a good friend Howard Strauss, and John as well, and others in the room, I feel a little inadequate to be presuming to share my views about the challenges in the Middle East or what it means for us here in Canada. But most of all, I think that I'm intimidated because we're in the presence of former Prime Minister Joe Clark, who served as what was then Secretary of State for External Affairs when I first came to Ottawa, and to whom I never lose an occasion to express appreciation, both to him and to those who, the talented people that surrounded him, who really provided me with essential mentoring when I was young and brash and needed some direction and guidance. The Roy Nortons, the Jodys, even the Larry Hagans. And I was fortunate to have on my board of the original CIC, not this one, but the Canada-Israel Committee that later morphed into the organization that I now have, somebody who became a dear friend, Stella Toronto, who was close to both Prime Minister Clark and his family. And she, I'm told, whispered in his ear when I first came, be kind to this young fellow, and he was. And I've always been in his debt for the kindness that he and his staff had shown me at the very beginning of my career. But David, while I'm really grateful for you having invited me to share in this evening, I have to return to Prime Minister Clark for a couple of observations that he made long ago that I think he would still agree with, but were made in a different context. For me to react to the context of this conversation. Because what troubles me about the way we have framed the discussion tonight is that we're looking at it as a debate, as if there are different perspectives of points of view that are going to, whether gently and diplomatically or more aggressively, butt heads in the hope that they will be persuasive and influence people's perspectives on an issue that touches all of us. And that's not the way I see it. I much prefer and have adopted a view that Michael referred to earlier in a slightly different context about rejecting the proposition of a zero-sum game. It isn't an either-or proposition. And if I have learned anything from when I first came to Ottawa, it was these two things. First, in a meeting once with Mr. Clark when he was serving as Secretary of State, one of my leadership complained to him about a particular direction that we were going on, and saying, but that is what our constituency is demanding of us. And you said something that has stuck with me ever since, and it was this: sometimes leaders have to lead, not follow. And it stuck with me because what it speaks to is a responsibility that leadership have to inform the thinking of those that claim some association with them. And in the context of the discussion about the Middle East, there's been a lot of focus about what's going on over there and what John Kerry's doing and how people are reacting and responding and all of that. But the part of the proposition that was read out at the beginning, the question of what contribution can Canada make, has largely been ignored. And I think that that's what we have to focus on, because we can only exercise exceedingly limited impact on what a Mahmoud Abbas says, or what a Bibi Netanyahu says, or what a John Kerry does, or what any of the other stakeholders and players in the region may contribute to the process. The single thing that we have most control over is what we do here in Canada, and what we export from Canada in the hopes that that is going to contribute to and advance the peace process. And what leaders do is reject the temptation, as frankly I'm doing now, to respond to what one might regard as shocking perspectives on what is going on over there. To reject that temptation and in favor of exploring how is it that we can add value, how is it that we can contribute. The second thing that Mr. Clark taught me, the very beginning of my career here in Ottawa, was that thinking out of the box isn't an alternative, it's essential. I don't know if you still have the scars on your back, but I do. Of an initiative that most of you will, if you ever knew about it, have forgotten it. But as Secretary of State, Mr. Clark convened a meeting in Montebello of Jewish leaders, of Palestinian leaders, and of some others that were able to contribute to the discussion. And he put forward to them a proposition. And it was, how can we here do two things? One is insulate Canadian society from the toxicity of conflict elsewhere. And B, how is it that we can help build a political will for peace amongst our own constituencies, in partnership, and then to export that to the region. That was a second lesson that stayed with me forever. And along the way, all the Michael Bells informed my thinking, because I was frankly receptive to the idea of others not competing with me, but enhancing what it was that I can offer. So when I stand before you tonight and I say there was not a single constituency in this country that spoke out more consistently or strongly to the current government of Canada about providing support and assistance to the Palestinian Authority than my organization. And when we talk about Prime Minister Harper's trip to the region, and I don't want to offer any kind of personal assessments of it, it wasn't a trip to Israel, it was a trip to the region. Yes, media attention to his time in Israel was significant. Perhaps less significant was the time that he spent in Ramallah, where in meeting with the PA leadership, he continued the unprecedented aid that Canada has given to the Palestinian Authority, first in a tranche of $300 million over a 5-year period, and then extending it this year by an additional $66 million, representing 1/5 of what he had given previously, but also reflecting the government's new orientation about not doing multi-year funding and limiting it to 1 year at a time. That kind of support that Canada provides for Israel makes us a stakeholder. Much like the kind of work and the contribution that we made with respect to enhancing the capacity of the Palestinian Authority to exercise ownership of the security protocol has been meaningful. Operation Proteus, which was headed up by Canadians, a multidisciplinary force that provided training and expertise to Palestinian security forces, has been identified as the single most successful initiative the international community has been able to provide for Palestinians since the beginning of Oslo. And it has Made in Canada printed on its label. That's a meaningful contribution. That's the way that Canada adds value. During the peak of the Oslo process back in the 90s, Canada was given responsibility for the Refugee Working Group. They were even afraid to call it the chairmanship, so they called it Canada was the gavel holder, because it was such a volatile subject area to be put in charge of. And Canada continues to stand ready when the parties are willing and invite Canada to play that role, to continue the work that it has led in one of the most controversial and difficult dimensions of the peace process. But it doesn't end with government. It's a mistake for us to attach to the government of Canada all responsibility for the Canadian contribution. And this is where I circle back to where I began. It cannot be a zero-sum game. Mike Atala, sitting over here, gave me, I'm Jewish, but he gave me my first epiphany. And it was years ago, I don't remember when it was. And I don't want to be for a moment dismissive of legitimate Palestinian aspirations in terms of nationhood. But what this fellow taught me was that what is core and essential for every Palestinian on the street isn't just this notion of statehood. It's the notion of personal dignity. It's the ability to know that they can send their kids to school and they don't have to worry about them being loose on the streets for 6 weeks at a time, that they can pay their insurance premiums, that their job is stable, that indeed they have the ability to go and deliver groceries to their mothers in the village just 6 kilometers away without having to invest an entire day in crossing checkpoints back and forth. When I hear the zero-sum game being played out on the backs of that Palestinian on the street, where some Palestinian leaders reject the ideas of economic development absent some whole magical package of everything coming together, where there's the inability to see Palestinians advance in material benefit because they don't want to make the occupation palatable. Really what they're saying is, we're all or nothing. We will accept that Palestinians should live in desperate circumstances for however long it takes for us to realize our dreams, rather than adopt an incremental approach that provides Palestinians with more and more of that personal dignity that allows them to become stakeholders for peace. So when it comes to the issue of what are we supposed to do as Canada, we know what our government can do. The question we have to ask ourselves, frankly, in this room, is what do we do? During the heyday of Oslo, there were a number of initiatives that brought Palestinians and Jews here in Canada together, looking to provide a pool of investment for the territories, to be able to partner here as a model for partnering there. I have to tell you that when I contemplate the kind of effort that goes into signing up different segments of Canadian society to things like the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, which we can talk about, but I don't want to waste your time with in the introductory comments, is both wrong-headed and immoral. But diverting attention there, as opposed to asking some of those same target groups that you want to buy into BDS to invest in programs that are going to draw Israeli and Palestinian children together, to normalize the relationship, to help them build the capacity from the ground up rather than imposed from the top down, to see the other not as an enemy, not as alien, but as a partner, to foster collaboration in scientific and business endeavors. All the different things that we as Canadians, not as a Canadian government, but as Canadians can invest in, I would suggest is as much a responsibility in advancing the peace process as anything that John Kerry is doing. And if we're really committed to making a material difference for Palestinians, as well as Israelis, then I think that we have to recalibrate our focus and our direction. And we have to go away from the notion of debate to a notion of value added. We have to create the 21st century model of Montebello. And we have to show a determination to do it here as a living example of what they can achieve over there. Thank you very much.
Each and every one of you for such eloquent, detailed, and broad presentations on a very obviously emotional and difficult subject. So now it's the time for the audience to participate. We're not constrained by CPAC. CPAC really should have been here filming this, because I think they would have had some riveting television and some much more advanced commentary on this issue than probably comes into the regular Canadian media. But fortunately, it is being filmed in an amateur way by both the CIC and I also think CGPME. So it will be posted on social media and perhaps on the websites of CJPME and also CIJA, which has an excellent website, by the way. You should get on their mailing list. So that means that some of your questions or comments may also appear for the benefit of posterity. So if anyone would like to ask a question or make a comment, we can go for until we all get too hungry, but we can probably go for 15, 20 minutes, and even longer if there's a desire to do so. So thank you. Just introduce yourself and try and be brief.
Yes, my name is Michael Shkolnik. I'm a first-year PhD student at NIPSIA, dealing with conflict resolution. My question is for Mr. Woodley specifically, but maybe the other panelists can touch up on it. First of all, I noticed in your presentation that you claim to represent an organization that for justice and for all human rights for all Middle Eastern inhabitants, but the pictures I saw were a bulldozer, the security wall, and a crying Palestinian mother. I didn't see any suicide bombings or rockets or a crying Israeli mother. So my question is, you were referring a lot to settlement building as an impediment to peace, and I'm sure most of the people in the room would agree with that. So I'd like to hear your comments on Palestinian incitement or perpetual and systematic perceptions of blurring the lines between occupied territory and post-67 Israel and pre-1967 Israel and mainstream Palestinian media referring to Haifa and Tel Aviv as Palestine, and delegitimization of Jews and anti-Semitic sentiment throughout Palestinian society.
That sounded like about 5 questions to me, but I'll do my best.
So just talk about Palestinian incitement from your perspective. Is that an impediment to peace? To what extent is it? And if it's just rhetoric for the domestic consumption, what implications does that have for societal perceptions as a whole?
Well, I think absolutely there's Palestinian sentiment. I think in both peoples, you have a bell curve, right? You have extremists on both sides, and you certainly have extremists on the Palestinian side who are willing to blow themselves up as suicide bombers, and you have extremists on the Israeli side who are willing to walk into a mosque and start shooting people. So it's terrible, terrible, terrible. And I've always said we can't let the extremists control the debate, that we have to let the moderates act. In answer to your question, Palestinian incitement, let's take Operation Cast Lead as an example. Israel justified Operation Cast Lead was what it was launched. Israel launched an operation against Gaza at the end of 2008, I guess it was, very end of 2008, and when for about 3 weeks into 2009. And Israel launched that war with three stated intents. The three intents were to stop the rockets from being shot from Gaza, to stop the smuggling through the tunnels, and to weaken Hamas. By the way, to weaken Hamas, that would actually be a political objective, which would actually mean that you're working militarily to obtain a political objective, which is actually the definition of terrorism. But be that aside, those are the three objectives: stop the rockets, stop the smuggling through the tunnels, and weaken Hamas. It actually turned out that since the rockets from Gaza had begun about 10 years before, I think they began in 2001, and Operation Cast Lead was, say, 2008. About 30 Israelis had been killed by rocket attacks from Gaza, so a very small number. Certainly it creates tension in Sderot and other Israeli communities, so I'm not dismissing that, but in terms of actual deaths, it was about less than 30 deaths at that time. Operation Cast Lead, actually, there were actually 13 deaths on Israel's side as a result of Operation Cast Lead. 4 of them were friendly fire, and the other were miscellaneous incidents, I guess, with rocket fire and some of the fighting that went on in Gaza. But you take a look at that, and so 1,400 Palestinians were killed. So you have rocket attacks that killed 30 people over 8 or 9 years. Then you have a 3-week assault that kills 1,400 Palestinians and 13 Israelis over 3 weeks. And I say, can't we take a different approach to this? Hasn't sort of the smash them down, squash them type of approach, haven't we tried that enough? And can't we try a different approach? And in fact, Hamas was not weakened. In fact, the rockets were not stopped. And in fact, the smuggling continued through the tunnels. So in fact, none of those Israeli military objectives were actually satisfied through that. So you sort of say, can't we take a different approach? And one of my friends years ago said, and it's a sentiment that's been echoed in various ways many times since, we can have the strongest military in the world, but if we don't have peace with our neighbors, we'll never have security. So let's address the legitimate grievances and let's deal with them.
Do you have anything to say about incitement or lowering the tensions or non-zero-sum games?
So the question was about incitement. I'm not sure that the one posing the question got any particular insight, but I will simply suggest in a word or two why incitement from an Israeli perspective is such an important issue. Because whether you talk about concessions or compromises or the way that Ambassador Bell framed it, accommodation, what Israel has to contemplate doing in order to advance to peace, however you want to deal it out, would require a significant amount of movement or accommodation or compromise. And when they're weighing and evaluating whether the situation on the ground merits that kind of consideration, they have to look at what are the intentions of the partner. So there are limits to what a partner can control. There are clerics in mosques that will say things and they're not accountable to the PA, and there's very limited ability for a Mahmoud Abbas to influence that. But when they look and they see that PA-controlled media is serving as a platform for some of the most despicable anti-Semitic images, comments, and the like, it raises for them questions about the confidence that they can have in their partner. So that most basically is why incitement is such a significant element of the tests that the parties use to determine what level of confidence they can have in their partner.
Michael?
Well, I don't know that I have that much to add, but I'd like to respond on the question of Gaza and the Israeli military strikes. As we've all accepted, I think, at this table, this was occasioned by a Hamas offensive into Israel, in which some 30 people were killed. Now one can say that that is not that many, but the reality is, if you're looking at mindsets, Israelis do not expect this. They may get it, they don't expect it. Maybe they should, maybe they shouldn't, but they don't. That's a hard reality. Anybody that is a prime minister, as Mr. Olmert was, has to respond. He's in an election campaign. There's massive shelling. That's the reality. It would be nice if it weren't the reality, if he didn't have to respond, if there could be more subtle ways to deal with this. For myself, I think it would have been foolhardy of him not to respond. I don't know the statistics, but I know that Hamas is considerably weakened with what it was, and it's much more careful now than it has been about launching such attacks, and they're generally nowadays done by fringe groups. So that I think there has been effect, albeit at tremendous cost. But I do think that governments, if one looks at it in terms of, I'm in the skin of the other guy, I'm the Prime Minister of Israel, here's a city in Israel being attacked, what do I do? It becomes much easier to understand why that happened. That doesn't mean that I don't, if I blame any Israeli for the screw up in Gaza, it was Sharon, the man who withdrew because there was no infrastructure left. It wasn't a mentoring process to make sure that Gaza had an even chance of success as a governing entity. And that was, I think, been vital to be done in everybody's interest. It wasn't done. But having said that, in response to these attacks, I've spent 9 years living in Israel, and I don't think one could have expected any other response than what one had.
Okay, well, Gaza. Why don't we take 3 interventions here, and then the panelists can respond. Perhaps we will run out of time by then, but we'll see.
Hi, my name is Allison Grant, and I'm a student at the Public and International Affairs Master Program at CIC-Ottawa. So, Mr. Woodley, I'm glad you mentioned human rights for everyone, as well as 3 key issues: Hamas, the release of prisoners from Israeli prisons that have murdered Israeli civilians, as well as the issue of Abbas not adequately representing the Palestinian people. So we've heard lots about what's happening right now. I'd like to get more of an optimistic slant from the panelists about the future. Assuming a settlement is reached that results in a Palestinian state, how is that state going to work to guarantee the safety of everyone, including Israelis?
Okay, we'll keep that in mind. That's a good question. Professor Muzu, a member of the Middle East Study Group. Glad to see you.
So good evening. My name is Costanza Muso. I'm a professor at the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Ottawa. So I have a question for each speaker. Thank you very much for a very interesting and informative evening. So to Michael, I was wondering whether you can tell us, maybe elaborate a little bit further on your ideas about how Canada can contribute to one of the crucial issues, which is that of the refugees. So I know that now there is some renewed activity the Americans are paying more attention to this particular issue and how it can be solved. And I know that you have looked into a variety of options, from compensations to apologies, and so maybe you can tell us a little bit more about that. To Mr. Fogel, I was wondering whether you can comment on the recent Canadian government support for the report recognizing the Jewish refugees, and how that's going to play, in your view, how that's going to play in the negotiation. We know that this has been something coming for a few years. The UN resolution in question talks about refugees in general. There has been a push to recognize the issue of the 800,000 Jewish refugees from Arab states following 48. So how do you think this is going to play? Do you think it's going to add a layer of complexity, especially if it's going to be linked with the issue of the Palestinian refugees, which is a separate issue, obviously? And finally, to Mr. Woodley, as a professor, I would like to ask you a question. I've looked at your website, and I see that you do refer to the BDS movement. You endorse in the website boycott of products and cultural boycott, but you also talk more broadly about BDS and its work. And as a professor, I'm particularly concerned with the academic boycott. I have invited Israeli speakers, and I've invited Jewish Israeli speakers, but I've also invited Arab Israeli professors from Israeli institutions who are Arab Israelis. And they've all given to my students interesting perspective on the topic on which they were experts. One speaker explained to my student in a way that no one ever did the very complex relationship between state and religion in Israel, the so-called status quo letter of Ben-Gurion, and what that means, and how religion and civil society in Israel interact. And another speaker was able to talk to great detail about the particular role of Arab Israeli, their identity, how they relate to themselves and to the other Palestinians as Israeli citizens. If I were to endorse this idea of an academic boycott, I could not invite any of these speakers. And frankly, I really don't see, as an academic, I don't see, I understand the boycott in general, boycotting products, but the academic boycott concerns me particularly because I really see this as an abdication of what university is meant to do. And I don't see what it contributes in the least. Thank you.
Keep those in mind, and we'll just take the last one here.
Hi, I'm Barbara Balfour. I'm a master's student at Carleton University, and I'm actually studying Jewish Canadian print media. So my question is for you, Mr. Fogel, closer to home. Given that support for Israel is such an important part of Canadian Jewish political activity and social identity, and given the newest definition of anti-Semitism being criticism of Israel, I wonder if you can comment on whether there's enough space for Canadian Jews to have open and uncensored dialogue with one another here at home, and if you would have any recommendations perhaps on the ethnic media landscape in terms of Canadian Jewish publications currently available, if there's enough room within all these publications to allow for a debate that represents perspectives of the entire Jewish community. Thanks.
So why don't we start with you, Shimon?
So if George, if you'll permit me, perhaps I'll take all of the issues that were posed, and I'll offer my take on them. The first raised the question of, inshallah, after peace comes, how do we expect, or how do we anticipate a Palestinian government being able to exercise adequate control, security, and so forth, both for its domestic population as well as for surrounding countries, whether it's Israel, Jordan, whatever's left of Syria, and the like. I think that if we draw that back to potential roles and actual roles that Canada has been playing, we have to give consideration to what the international community, including Canada, has seen as its responsibility in helping to provide Palestinians with the capacity to build up civil society. A lot of Canadian resources have gone into the judiciary, in building up institutions that would allow for Palestinians to become increasingly the owners of those elements of civil society that really define us as countries, as nation states, as communities. There have been, one of the things that Secretary Kerry has been very focused on, but that doesn't benefit from quite as much attention, is the raising of capital and resources within the international community in order to provide assistance for Palestinians to develop exactly the kind of infrastructure that's necessary for a state to be successful. So I think there, not only Canada, but all of the international community has a role and a responsibility to assist Palestinians in developing the self-sufficient capacity on all aspects and dimensions of the operation of statehood. With respect to the issue on refugees that was posed directly to me, it related to the hearings held by the Standing Committee of Foreign Affairs last year and the government's response just earlier this week to the all-party unanimous recommendations that flowed from the committee hearings. We were, as we indicated in a media release, really pleased both with the work of the committee as well as the government's response. The question was, so what, and what do we do with that? What the government responded to and what has now become more formally incorporated in Canadian foreign policy is a recognition that at the time of the creation of the State of Israel, looking at the period from 48 to perhaps 51, there were two refugee populations that were created, a Palestinian refugee population and a Jewish refugee population. The Jewish population coming from all of the surrounding Arab states throughout the Crescent, the Maghreb, the more immediate region, an equal or perhaps greater number. We have long felt, and I don't think that we're alone in this, that the absence of recognition of the experience of Jewish communities from Arab countries was a failure in providing an accurate and full canvas of developments in the early part of Israel's history. And we think that its integration into the general narrative is an essential element that not only corrects the historical record, but provides for validation for a population that suffered not inconsiderably during that period. The fact that all Jewish refugees were either absorbed and naturalized within Israel or found their ways and made permanent homes elsewhere, including here in Canada, but as well in Europe and elsewhere, doesn't mitigate or diminish their claim. But when it comes to claims, my sense from my discussions with leadership within the communities that comprise Jews from Arab states, my sense is what they're looking for is that validation. I don't think they're looking for the kind of compensation that one would typically associate with those kind of demands. If anything, I know that there is currently a debate going on about a repository of archival information that was rescued from some flood in Iraq some years back and was brought to the States for just technical rehabilitation. And so there is a desire on the part of the expat Iraqi Jewish community to have those records preserved in a way that they would be accessible to the families into the international community, so they have a concern about it going back to Iraq. But there, what we're speaking about is sort of a collective legacy, not personal compensation. And I think what they would be looking for is a way for the international community to address the reality of the historical record by somehow preserving their presence there over a period of really 2 millennia. I mean, the Babylonian Talmud was crafted in what's now Iraq. Jews will celebrate the festival of Purim in a couple of weeks' time. That took place in what's current day Iran. So there really is a very, very long, thousands of year history over there, and I think that they're just looking for that kind of collective validation. On the issue of BDS, where you talked about academic boycott, I would suggest to you, David, that it would be time well spent for you to organize a session dedicated to the whole proposition, legitimacy and value of boycott, divestment, and sanctions. And I'd be more than happy to participate in that. It's a very big topic, and it doesn't lend itself to very quick discussions. But I will say this, it is ironic that in the exercise of BDS, where there are countries where academics are imprisoned, are required to flee, are silenced and censored in all sorts of ways, the BDS movement would pick the only country in which there's absolute academic freedom and a robust debate about everything, including the political process. It is not just wrong-headed because it's counterproductive and hardens positions both on the Palestinian side as well as the Israeli side, but it's immoral. So I'm pleased that consistently Canadian institutions, especially academic institutions, are rejecting the proposition of divestment and boycott and sanctions. And I would hope that over time we will see that this is a wrong-headed direction to go in that really is only divisive as opposed to identifying those things that are going to bring people together. Finally, on the question that is specific to the Jewish community, the question relates to something that is, for us as an organization, an overriding preoccupation. And you have all, I am sure, in one context or other, heard the notion of trying to establish or preserve the big tent, where everybody has a place around the table, where everybody has a voice, where there is the ability to articulate a point of view in a safe way, not because somebody's going to beat you up, but because somebody is going to delegitimize you. What I will correct, Ms. Balfour, I don't know exactly where you are, but there is no one, certainly not in my community, that would suggest that criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic. Israelis criticize Israel. Israel thrives on self-criticism. The issue is, and where the lines between criticism of Israel and anti-Semitism begin to blur, is when that which is accorded every other nation and people is denied to the Jewish people, namely the legitimacy of having the right of self-determination and to resurrect a state in their ancestral homeland. In that respect, I dare say that the Jews are an Aboriginal people who suffered through millennia of exile, and that's not to suggest that 2,000 years doesn't create opportunities for new realities to come forward and complications that arise from them. But the issue is not criticism of Israel. The issue is delegitimization of Israel as the homeland of the Jewish people. What we have done in the Jewish community is work very hard to ensure that the whole range of voices are heard, have a place. It certainly has a place around our table, But it also is something for which we've tried to create various platforms. So our town hall series ensures, for example, that in a debate about settlements, that those participating in those town halls will have an opportunity to hear someone like Naftali Bennett, who was referred to earlier, who is supportive of settlements and the notion of Greater Israel, as well as those who are passionately opposed to settlements, think that it's corrosive and morally wrong and practically unhelpful. So whether it's in our town halls or in products that we've created like the Exchange, somebody suggested you look at our website, you can go to it and see a dedicated place called the Exchange, which provides people with, in effect, an open mic to write and share their perspective on a whole range of things, uncensored. It is edited because we want to keep a certain standard, but so we have to work hard to preserve the freedom and the access from everybody across the political spectrum. What we don't accept, though, is the legitimacy of those voices that reject the legitimacy of the State of Israel. And they aren't part of our tent. They're outside, and they'll always remain outside.
Thank you. Michael, sort of a final summing up and
Sure. I've
response?
got comments on a variety of issues here. I'll try to take not too much time in going through them, but running through some of these questions, and I know generally a preoccupation that's often asked me is, what can Canada do? What role do we have? And I would suggest, obviously we don't have a first-tier role, but we can make a real contribution. And I'm not just speaking about economic aid to the Palestinians, because if that's viewed as a palliative, in other words, you get the aid, then that serves as a substitute for the recognition or realization of your political rights, it's not going to work, as I think I inferred in the remarks I had made. Having said that, there are things that we have done that I think are unique and that we could continue doing. First of all, Canada Camp. That was a refugee camp located near Gaza on the Egyptian side of the border. Canadian government got together with the Israeli government. This was a Canadian initiative with the Israeli government, the Egyptian government, and the PLO, and decided that they could all agree that these people in Canada Camp on the Egyptian side of the border, Palestinian refugees, could relocate into their original homes within the Gaza Strip. This was when Israel still occupied the Gaza Strip. We took the lead, we got these parties together, and we got the Kuwaitis to pay for this relocation. So that is a real achievement. It's not something that makes headlines every day, and we're not going to get that. On refugees, I think the Refugee Working Group, which has been referred to here, is one of the most successful enterprises that Canada has taken part in. We now know, we led the group, there were many contributions from many different sources, international sources, but in doing this, governments, and certainly the Canadian government, appointed a team and left it alone to do its work. So there wasn't day-to-day or month-to-month or year-to-year, for that matter, political interference. And they outlined a concrete and specific series of measures designed to deal with Palestinian refugees in a way that would be non-threatening to Israel, but satisfy basic Palestinian desires, by giving them a series of options which would include return to Israel itself, although the conditions for such a return would be a disincentive for any. I've always said about the numbers that might come back, it would probably be less per annum than the number of illegal settlers, illegal Palestinians who from the West Bank or Gaza who move and in family relationships or what have you end up living in Israel. So I don't see it as a strategic threat, but that is not the primary option. There are many others. I won't bore you with them here, but they're very real, and they're accepted in the international community, and they're accepted in Washington. The last thing is the fate of Syrian Jews. This is one that gets almost no publicity. But the last Syrian Jews were, their exit from Syria was facilitated by the Canadian Embassy, and I don't think could have happened without the Canadian Embassy. Now, Judy Feld-Carr of Toronto made her life's work, the emigration of Syrian Jews from Syria. I don't mean to detract from that, but I know that the interventions we made and the persuasive arguments that we made with the Syrian authorities resulted in their decision to let these people go. So we can make a real contribution. The judicial monitoring, which we're doing now, other work which we're doing now. The problem now, as I see it, is that we are seen, the Canadian government is seen as so sympathetic to Israel at Palestinian expense that and at Arab expense, and if you want to generalize it somewhat more broadly, that our traditional role as a fair-minded party who could do many of these things is no longer there. Having said that, given the close relationship that this government has with the Israeli government, I think there are opportunities for us to have serious discussions about issues that we think need to be resolved perhaps in a different way. It's a question whether the government will use that moral suasion that it has with Israel to good effect or not at all. Jewish state. I wish the issue of the calling Israel a Jewish state or insisting that it be recognized as a Jewish state had never arisen. But being that it has, it's not going away. So to be faithful to my theme, I think this is a problem that one has to deal with. It can't be ignored. It's not going to be swept back under the carpet. I've somewhat of an aficionado of the situation in Palestine during the British Mandate. It was always intended with the Whitehead Commission and the Shaw Commission and what have you, that there be an Arab state and a Jewish state. Right from the very beginning, if we want to go back to the Balfour Declaration, where the word homeland is used because the word state was excised. It was excised, in fact, by Chaim Weizmann, the leader of the Zionist movement in Britain, because he felt it would be contentious. But always in the back of everybody's mind, there was to be a Jewish state formalized by the United Nations in the partition resolution. So if you read like Avi Shalit's book, this new bestseller, I think it creates a very clear picture that the Jewishness of the state, it goes right to the soul of Jewish being and identity. And that's not going to disappear. You might like it, you might not like it, but it's there, it's not going away. As far as treatment of others who are in Israel, minorities, I think with the external threat disappeared, if there were a comprehensive peace, you would find, my experience has been in moments of low tension, a greater fairness, if you like, in the way Palestinian citizens of Israel would be treated. In other words, they're seen as a bit of a fourth column here. That would dissipate and indeed could possibly disappear given the right circumstances, given peace with the surrounding Arab countries and the settlement of the Palestinian issue. Last point, Abu Mazen, he hasn't been elected for 9 years. He's out of it. He doesn't represent the entire Palestinian community. Boy, when you're in the Middle East, if you're looking for a consensus among all Palestinians before you move, from Hamas, from Islamic Jihad to whoever on the other side, you're never going to get it. He's the best representative that's available, puts forward a moderate point of view. It might be an authoritarian regime in a very qualified sense. There's freedom of speech, there's freedom of assembly, and what have you. Michael's nodding his head as though he's not so sure.
Okay.
But I think there is a dialogue and a freedom to express oneself the way there's not, and it wasn't in Iraq or Syria or Egypt, and for that matter, Jordan. So what's the choice? Having someone in this quasi-authoritarian position running things, or trying for a Western-style democratic political process? And we all know ourselves, when you try to get 100% of the people on side, you end up doing nothing. Those are the main points I wanted to make.
Thanks, Michael. I'm going to ask Thomas to sum up quickly, because they want to serve your Middle Eastern salad, couscous salad, by 8 o'clock. But you might want to come and learn more at his large event 2 weeks from now. So maybe that's a way of keeping it short.
Hopefully there'll be a little, and I'm not planning on going to 8:20, don't worry about it. Hopefully there'll be a little indulgence, since I did indeed accommodate Mr. Fogel earlier this evening. To your point, yes, in 2 weeks, the person that we're bringing here is Diana Boutou. She's a Palestinian lawyer, born in Toronto, but has worked many years in Palestine with Palestinian leadership, and was actually one of the lawyers representing Palestine at the International Court of Justice in 2003. So if you'd like to hear her, it'd be a very interesting event, talk a little bit more about the Palestinian legal framework and situation. So I won't try to comment on nearly as many things as Mr. Bell did, but I have asked our sound man to put on my thing in a moment. Not quite yet. Go back up if you don't mind. The first question was about the Palestinian state and how will it be in the future and how would it work and so on. Just make 2 points on that. Many of you may know John Mearsheimer. He's a professor of political science at the University of Chicago, sort of a realist in political science circles. And he wrote an article several years ago that really stuck with me. And he talked about sort of 3 potential outcomes in terms of negotiations between Palestinians and Israel. One outcome was a single, some people call it binational state. Mr. Bell has said he doesn't think that's feasible. But in any case, one single state where both Palestinians and Israelis live together with equal rights as citizens. The second would be the 2-state solution, which is currently sort of what's being discussed with Mr. Kerry and Abbas and the Israeli team. And then the third option for him was an apartheid state. And what he means by that is sort of a refusal to give Palestinians full statehood, but also a refusal to give them rights as citizens, and that the only outcome resulting from that would be an apartheid state. That you'd have to, currently, for instance, you have Israelis that live in the settlements, which are located in the West Bank, who have the right to vote in Israeli elections, and yet they are surrounded by Palestinians who live right next to them, who do not vote in Israeli elections. And that sort of thing that would be entrenched into what Mr. Mearsheimer called an apartheid state. And in terms of looking at what might be possible in terms of, if you can go down 2 slides. Okay. This is a series of maps that you can find on the internet. There's a fair amount of research behind it that talks sort of about the progressive sort of loss of Palestinian land over the years. And if I can call your attention to the rightmost map, you'll sort of see that we've gone to a situation, say in 1967, the third map to the right, second to the right, the West Bank and Gaza with the 1967 borders, but because of the wall that Israel has been building, and because of the settlements that Israel has been building, and because of the various infrastructure, the roads and so on that have been established to sort of connect those things, and because of military zones, and because of Oslo Area C and so on, what's really left, what Palestinians can freely access, is just the remaining sections in green. And so you sort of say, okay, what will a Palestinian state actually be? What will it look like? And I mentioned in my presentation, I'm hopeful, I have to be hopeful that we'll find a Palestinian state. But it's also hard to see how you're going to create a Palestinian state through this. In some of my research, in terms of what's actually ever been offered, the Palestinians have actually never been offered what most of us would consider a state, which is control of your borders and control of your airspace and control of your radio spectrum and things like that. They've never been offered that. And so it's hard to conceive how the Palestinians are going to make up a state out of all these sort of disjointed pieces, and how they'll really think of it as a state. That being said, let's hope that they do, because currently the two-state solution is what's on the drawing board, right? What people are discussing. And in response to the question, how would such a thing work in terms of security and so on? And first of all, I think underlying that question is a certain assumption that Palestinians are somehow innately fanatic or something, that they don't like peace. No, nothing could be further from the truth. These are people just like us. They want their kids to go to school safely. They want the kids to be educated. They want opportunities for their children. They want to be able to hold a job till they retire, that sort of thing. So I think if you address the Palestinian grievances, you'll find the people that are very ready to live in peace with their neighbors. It's not that they want to live in a constant state of animosity with their neighbors, not at all. So I think if you can address the core concerns and grievances of the Palestinians, I don't think there'll be an issue of quote-unquote security, because you've addressed those issues in terms of the negotiations. So there's 2 points that I would make on that. And then the last thing I'll address, because it was directed specifically to me, about the boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaign. First of all, the academic boycott as conceived by the organizing committee does not rule out by any means the visit of Israeli academics here and there and so on. It's more of an institutional boycott, but in terms of singling out individual academics, that is entirely permitted under the academic volet of the boycott, divestment, sanctions oversight committee. The way I view boycott, divestment, and sanctions is it's something that should be driven by your conscience. Within my organization, we have people that believe that you should boycott all of Israel, and other people that believe that you should boycott only those Israeli companies that are doing business in the West Bank. Both of those can be justified. I think ultimately the boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaign is to put economic pressure on Israel to change its policies towards the Palestinians. And the committee, we boycott, to answer Mr. Fogel's question.
I didn't have a question.
Okay, to answer his comment, to respond to one of his comments, excuse me. Organizations like CJPME and hundreds of others around the world respond and promote boycott, divestment, sanctions because the Palestinians have asked for it. In 2005, 170,000 Palestinian civil society organizations got together and asked the international community to boycott Israel. So we are responding to that call. If there are other peoples that want to call for a boycott of their respective, something that they think should be boycotted, we should consider that as well. But first and foremost, organizations like CJPME do it because we've been asked to do so by Palestinian civil society. So that's one point there. And going back to my point about CJPME, we encourage people to do it by their conscience. I mentioned the example, whether or not you boycott all of Israel is just those companies doing it in settlements. Likewise, I have a friend in Toronto who's uncomfortable with the academic boycott. I say to him, that's fine. If it's according to your conscience. Ultimately, we're successful in putting pressure on Israel, and I'm thrilled that John Kerry and Barack Obama are talking about this because it's gone mainstream. And Mr. Fogel said earlier that Canadian institutions are rejecting BDS. I don't observe that at all. The United Church of Canada has adopted a policy to put economic pressure on Israel. Many Canadian organizations are responding to this. I'm absolutely
Canadian
thrilled.
Academic institutions.
Okay, I'm absolutely thrilled at the uptake within the international community in terms of people aligning with this. So I think look a little bit more into the boycott, divestment, sanctions campaign, and I think there's a place for everyone in that in terms of wanting to put that economic pressure so that Israel respects the rights of Palestinians.
Thank you very much. I'm going to ask Peter to come forward. Peter is not only a member of the CIC executive, but he sponsors an amazing and fascinating trip to Israel and Palestine. every November. Maybe he'll want to promote that because it's really something, and it probably competes against trips that these organizations sponsor as well. But
I
his
certainly
is
don't
very
want.
good.
I don't want to promote it tonight because everybody's waiting for their supper, George. Monsieur Bell, Monsieur Fogel, Monsieur Woodley, merci beaucoup pour vos présentations très intéressantes. Une soirée riche d'enseignement et d'apprentissage pour nous tous. I will not try to synthesize what I've heard. I think I've detected some different points of view. But I think something actually quite remarkable has happened here tonight without us really being aware of it. About 6 years ago, I joined the Canadian International Council, and at that time there was a study group on Latin America, and there was a study group on Africa, and I believe there was a study group at that time on the North. I think Blair Seaborn was the study group on the North. But there was not a study group on the Middle East. And I had an incipient interest in the Middle East, and so I asked a number of the wise men in the organization why that was the case and whether or not there could be a study group in the Middle East, and I was kind of warned off that maybe that would be too sensitive. It would not be a topic that the CIC could practically take on. But fortunately, a couple of people in the organization did encourage me, including Louise Tayomakai, who is here tonight, Barbara Darling, Michael Shenstone, I don't know if Michael's here tonight, Craig Hunter, and a number of other people encouraged me to go ahead, and we created a Middle East study group on a very clear basis. It was to be a study group, and we had people on various, people were to join a study group to try to better understand the situation. We brought in a variety of speakers over the last 3 years, the Palestinian ambassador, the Israeli ambassador. We had Michael talk about the issue that was going on in Lebanon. We had, the Egyptian ambassador. We had people from the Jewish diaspora here. We had people from UNRWA trying to understand this issue from a variety of perspectives. And I think was certainly extremely rich and helpful for me, and I was really happy that we've done so. And now we've taken another step. We actually have a CIC general dinner where we're having a discussion, a calm discussion, a rational discussion. Various points of view are being heard on the issue of Israel-Palestine. Clearly, we're not going to come to agreement tonight. I hope all of us have learned something from each of the presentations that have gone forward. We're all going to be able to digest our dinners despite the conversation. I think this is a tremendous step forward, and I think I commend David and George for putting this on tonight, and thank once again the three speakers for contributing. Thank you so much.